The US Epic verdict path did not award Epic billions in damages. It delivered something more disruptive for Google's business model, a permanent injunction aimed at Android app distribution and billing rules. Led by CEO Tim Sweeney, Epic Games secured court findings that Google illegally maintained Play Store power, and a court-ordered injunction limiting how Google can impose anti-competitive restrictions on distribution and billing. The case attacked anti-steering provisions that blocked developers from telling users about cheaper ways to pay outside the app. This was not a one-time European-style fine Google could simply budget, like the multi-billion-euro Android penalty it faced in the EEU. That was the cost of doing business. This was structural change, forcing Google to allow third-party Android app stores to access the Play Store catalog. The 30% cut wasn't just a fee, it was the toll on the only bridge into town. And to make sure no one found a back road, Google built a wall. This wall was constructed from specific clauses in its developer distribution agreement. The anti-steering provisions. Their language was absolute. Developers could not, inside their own apps, communicate ways to make purchases or obtain lower prices outside the Google Play billing system. No path to a direct sale, no mention of a better deal elsewhere. The app was a walled garden where the only cash register Google permitted was its own. The financial logic was clear. Separate internal documents estimated $6 billion in Play revenue at risk and $1.1 billion in annual profit at risk, tied to the spread of Epic's distribution approach. A staggering sum, a figure that would define the entire battle. So the anti-steering rules became the mechanism that held it all together. They transformed the Play Store from a venue into a chokehold. But this control didn't emerge from a single contract. It was the culmination of a years-long bargain, one that began with a powerful promise: we will build this market together. The question is, what happened to that partnership? Epic Games initially launched Fortnite on Android in 2018, deliberately bypassing the Play Store entirely. When the game finally arrived on Google's marketplace on April 21, 2020, the peace was short-lived. On August 13, 2020, Epic pushed a live update to Fortnite, smuggling in its own direct payment system. Players could now buy V-Bucks, bypassing Google's 30% toll entirely. It was a brazen, calculated violation. Google's retaliation was instantaneous. Within hours, Fortnite was axed from the Play Store. A digital eviction. The primary gateway to millions of Android users was sealed shut. A contractual breach had become a public war. The official story ended there. Enforcement of terms. But the real story was just beginning to leak out. The lawsuit Epic filed in response would reveal something larger. Internal documents surfaced a program called Project Hug, or the Game's Velocity Program. The allegations painted a different picture. This wasn't a neutral marketplace. It was an ecosystem allegedly sustained by handshake deals and financial incentives designed to keep the biggest players and their revenue inside the walled garden. Internal communications revealed subsidies flowing to developers and phone makers, securing their exclusive loyalty to the Play Store. The removal of Fortnite suddenly looked less like a rulebook being enforced, and more like the elimination of a dissident. The question hanging in the air was no longer about a single app's payment buttons. It was about the foundation of the store itself. Was Google's dominance earned through service, or was it fortified by a fortress of contracts and quiet agreements that made competition structurally impossible? Project Hug was not a hug. It was a straitjacket. Epic alleged Google used the Game's Velocity Program, also known as Project Hug, to keep major game publishers inside the Play Store, discouraging them from launching competing Android app stores or distributing outside Google's walls. Google maintained it was an incentive program, not a formal exclusivity mandate. The offer, as described in trial coverage, was simple: money, marketing support, featured placement. The alleged price was loyalty. The allegation was that these agreements were built to discourage the world's biggest developers from ever stepping foot on a rival Android storefront. Preemptive war on competition, fought with cash instead of cannons. This wasn't about promoting growth, it was about enforcing a perimeter. Separate internal documents estimated up to $6 billion in Play Store revenue and $1.1 billion in annual profit at risk if Epic-style distribution spread. A staggering sum that made alternative runways look barren. The program wasn't a partnership. It was a moat. The strategy drew fire from half a world away. South Korea's Fair Trade Commission scrutinized Google's App Store practices and in-app payment rules as part of a broader regulatory push. The message was clear. This wasn't just a private legal dispute. Regulators saw patterns that threatened an entire market. And they weren't alone in seeing patterns. The U.S. case against Google over Play Store distribution and billing was already on a collision course with a jury, and later, a permanent injunction path. The fight was about platform architecture, not a single game ban. Competitors and developers watched to see whether exclusivity by incentive could survive antitrust scrutiny. The allegations around Project Hug were now fuel for a larger fire. Google wasn't just defending Fortnite's removal. It was being forced to defend the architecture of its Android distribution rules. The question was no longer if there were walls. It was whether those walls violated antitrust law. The coordinated legal assault had found its cracks. In the United States, the fight ran through a Northern District of California jury, then a permanent injunction, then appeal. On July 31, 2025, a unanimous Ninth Circuit panel affirmed the jury verdict for Epic Games against Google and upheld the district court's injunction. The panel held that Google willfully maintained monopoly power in Android app distribution and in-app billing, unreasonably restrained trade, and unlawfully tied Play Store distribution to Google Play billing. That ruling was not a vague press headline. It left in place a structural remedy, a multi-year injunction that restricts Google from paying partners to disadvantage rival app stores, and that forces open catalog access and distribution pathways competitors could not previously force by negotiation alone. After the Ninth Circuit affirmance, the parties returned to the district court on compliance and modification. On March 4, 2026, Google publicly stated that Epic and Google entered a new settlement agreement and asked the district court to enter a revised modified injunction. Docket activity in the Northern District of California shows joint motions to modify the permanent injunction, party agreement seeking court entry of revised terms, not a blank check that every global Google case ended the same day. The lever was the affirmed U.S. injunction path, not an EEU fine from a different docket. What mattered for Android developers in the United States was structural. Anti-steering and billing lock-in were no longer insulated by final appellate blessing. Litigation risk stopped looking like a line item. It looked like a redesign mandate. The message from California was unambiguous. When a jury finds monopoly maintenance and a court of appeals affirms both liability and injunctive relief, platform rules become court-supervised architecture, not private house policy. The Ninth Circuit's July 31, 2025 opinion closed the liability chapter of Epic's U.S. Play Store case against Google. Jury verdict affirmed, permanent injunction upheld. What followed was not the erasure of every Google antitrust fight worldwide. It was a U.S. Android distribution fight moving from liability to compliance, settlement papers, and modified injunction motions on top of an already affirmed remedial order. On March 4, 2026, Google stated that Epic and Google entered a new settlement agreement and asked the U.S. District Court to enter a revised modified injunction. That is a primary party-side disclosure of ongoing court-supervised redesign. Treat it as what it is, a negotiated path to rewrite play practices under the injunction framework, not a global final judgment that swallows unrelated European or Apple dockets. The burden of proof has shifted in practice for this market. For decades, dominant platforms could treat exclusive distribution and billing rules as ordinary product design. That defense no longer survives a jury finding of monopoly maintenance plus an affirmed injunction. When restrictive contractual terms sit on top of market power, the platform must show competition is open in substance, not only in branding. Do not confuse this docket with Epic versus Apple. Different store, different remedies history, different appellate trail. The Google Play case stands on its own record, a U.S. jury, a Northern District injunction, and a Ninth Circuit affirmance that made structural change the center of gravity. The doctrines that matter going forward are concrete: anti-steering limits, billing lock-in, payments to lock out rival stores, catalog access. Those are the load-bearing terms of the injunction path. Every platform negotiation in Android distribution now sits in that shadow. If this analysis provided clarity, a like on the video is appreciated. Does an affirmed injunction change digital competition more than a one-time fine ever could? We invite your analysis in the comments